the reason I'm doing it on the screen when you have the printout in front of you is I'm recording it, so I'm following through. So note, again, just to remind you, the directions are to do only one question. In other words, it would not be following directions to give me 2 or 3 sentences on each one of them. It's not a short answer. So these you can do open book, open notes. I'll remind you what you do Monday is going to be closed book, closed notes. And so I used to tell people to look at the question pool also as a review sheet, because if you use your common sense, it will become obvious that stuff that I would want to focus on for essay question prompts are also the, the material is also the stuff that is what I'm going to focus on for, the objective questions. So again, the essay, just to remind people, is due Monday. And I will look over a draft, but don't send me one late Sunday night and expect to get feedback on it. Send me something Saturday, I'll try to get back to you, or earlier on Sunday. Okay, so explain, discuss, and evaluate the following passage from The Myth of the Cave. For the prisoner's reality would consist of nothing but the shadows. Well, you want to explain things like the fact that they are down there. In a question like this, you want to do a little background. Describe the situation in the cave. Why is it that the prisoners are acquainted only with the shadows? And, we know that they've been down there since early childhood. We know that that's all that they experience because their head and necks are chained so that presumably they can see only the shadows. And that, for them, is reality. Right? So, concerning the prisoner's belief, what was wrong with it? Well, a lot of things are wrong with it, right? For Plato, obviously these prisoners are thinking what is most real is, for Plato, on his view of reality, the least real. Because the shadows are a poor copy of things in this world, and things in this world are a poor copy of the forms. So the shadows are really twice removed from reality. Again, this is an area where you have to get your mind around something that's different from the way we think about things. Folks, please put your phones away, unless you're taking notes on them. This is, you wonder why 16 to 19% of the people who start where you are actually finish. It's stuff like this that's part of the reason. I almost got run off the road this morning because somebody's got her phone in her hand, not even looking what lane she's in. Okay, back to business. Well, you want to explain how they came by the belief that the shadows are the most real. I already said that. And of course, what has them altering or questioning this belief. Now, I'm going through this kind of fast because we got a lot to go over, but also because I'm recording it. You know, you can play this back integrity at your own speed, you know. But obviously what got at least the released prisoner, and what would get any of them to alter this belief, is if you took them on a philosophical journey of their own. But as we see from Plato's story, only one of them gets to go. The others are not willing to do this. And, you know, Plato's portraying the walk up out of the cave as a hard walk, and the first time the guy sees the objects that are carried, that are casting the shadows, those objects, you know, first of all, it's hard for him to see that because his eyes have to adjust to the fire. But then, when he's told that they are more real than the shadows, he initially does not want to believe that. You know, and this highlights something that's true today. If we're confronted with some of our cherished beliefs, or beliefs we had inculcated into us from our culture, it's not easy for us to alter those beliefs. And, you know, so in other words, what I'm doing is cluing you in to places you should go if you choose number one as your essay prompt, but I'm also trying to review things in some detail as we go along. How are these unusual prisoners supposed to be like us? Well, I mean, there are really two ways, and this depends on which one of Plato's two meanings you talk about, right? Here, you know, I'm referring to what's in that handout, which you have a printout of the meanings of the allegory in the cave. The unusual prisoners are supposed to be like us in that they are in an environment that represents a sort of intellectual or cultural environment. And for Plato, I mean, the prisoners, for Plato and Socrates, are their fellow Athenians who don't want to be confronted about their cherished beliefs, whether it's about the gods or about what justice is, or about a number of other topics, whether morality is established or relative. And, you know, it's Plato and Socrates who are the people who have them confront these beliefs. So the prisoners are like us in representing people like us who have grown up in a particular cultural environment. But also the prisoners are like us, if you want to talk about Plato's other meaning, in the fact that, remember, everything inside the cave, if we're talking about now the third column, everything inside the cave represents things in this world, the physical world. You know, I go through that sheet in some detail in that recorded lecture. And so, as I pointed out before, like Madonna, we don't have a choice about whether we are physical beings in the physical world. And we tend to look at things in the physical world as being the most real. What we can experience with our five senses. With the prisoner's five senses, they could experience the shadows, they could also experience the things in the cave carried by you know, the people, the things that were casting the shadows. So So we're like the prisoners in that we're imprisoned in a physical body, and as a result, we tend to think that things in the physical world are the most real. And again, this is something a lot of students still don't understand when you run it by them several times. Plato is trying to get you to accept a view that abstract realities are more real than physical realities because they are changeless, they are eternal, they are perfect. In other words, for Plato, the perfect triangle, that's the standard for all triangles, the form of a triangle, is eternal, unchanging, perfect. Any triangle down here comes and goes. It's not eternal. It's very imperfect. You know. So whether you accept it or not, you know, one of the hurdles, the intellectual hurdles to trying to see what Plato is trying to convince us of is to see that he's trying to stand most people's ordinary views on their head. They think the physical world and things their senses put them in touch with are the most real and lasting. Whereas he's trying to say, no, it's things that only your reason can put you in touch with, namely the forms that are the most real. And of course, what's represented by the forms, you know, again, this is that third view. This is Plato's view of reality. Well, everything outside the cave is the intellectual world, the world that only reason puts us in touch with. So, okay. Any questions about the subject matter of question 1? So again, I revise this. Even if I go over a question sheet there, it's going to be a bit different from this one. This is not totally different, but I've enhanced it. That's why I'm going over this. Okay. What does he imagine the laws would say to him? Well, basically, Socrates imagines that the laws would come to him and say, why are you trying to destroy us? And I mean, why would they say this? You know, so that's the response they would give. I'm following this. And the reason they'd say this is because, remember, Socrates could have chosen exile at his trial as his proposed penalty, whereas the prosecutors were vying for the death penalty. Now, had the jury voted, had Socrates chosen exile and the jury voted for exile, then the court system would have done its job. If the jury voted in favor of exile, Socrates could have left with the state's blessing. He would be in line with what the court system decided, and he could have gone into exile and lived out the rest of his life. But we saw that he does not do that. He says he doesn't think he deserves any penalty, not even a small fine. And so he gives an in-your-face reply. Socrates says, well, you want a penalty? Here's a penalty. 3 meals for life in the Prytaneum, the lavish state dining hall. That is, give me state pension as my penalty. Because, he said, what he's doing and this relates back to the allegory of the cave, what he is doing in challenging them daily to examine their lives, examine what they think is most important in life, and question their beliefs. Socrates says, what I'm doing as a philosopher is so important. Yeah, I shouldn't need to worry about where my next meal is coming from. You ought to give me a state pension. Well, of course, that's no penalty. And, remember, as we said, the jury really does not have a second option on the table as a penalty, right? Because what Socrates proposed as a penalty obviously was not one. So they voted for the only penalty that was there, which was the death penalty. So how is that relevant to what's going on with the Crito and what the laws would say? Well, now, having, the court having expressed its will and the state expressing its will through the courts, that he is to remain there and await execution of sentence, which the execution in ancient Greek was accomplished by either giving a prisoner a glass of poison that was basically made by boiling the bark of a hemlock tree. That's why they call it hemlock. Or forcing the prisoner to drink it. And so the will of the state is that he be executed. So now, if Socrates accepts his friend's offer of escape, he is not going to leave with the state's blessing. He's overturning the verdict of the court that said he's supposed to stay and await execution, and he's challenging the laws. So that's why the laws are saying, why would you destroy us? Because the city can't last if its laws and the verdict of its courts are overturned at will by private individuals. And the example I gave of this is if everybody decided, I mean, it's a trivial example, but it works. If everybody decided tomorrow they're not going to obey any red lights, we'd have chaos, right? If private individuals want to overturn the laws, at will, the state falls apart. So the idea is that if he were to accept his friend's offer of escape, he would be basically going against the verdict of the courts, and he would be harming the state. And this is important because to him, there are two reasons why he doesn't think he has the right to harm the state. One is that he views the state as being like a parent. And the laws of the state, it was under the laws of Athens that his parents got married, that they had him. He was raised and educated, and so Socrates views the state as if it were a parent, and we should obey our parents. And Socrates says we have no right to harm or strike back at the state because we're not on the same level as the state. Just as a child is not on the same level as its parents. Now, the other thing that's going on here is, and the other reason why he says he should not escape is that there's a general moral principle that we should not knowingly harm someone, and so Socrates says I would break that moral principle that we ought not to do harm to people. So so the point is, if you do question 2 for folks who walked in, glad you're here. Should you choose question 2, you want to give some background before you go into the opinion part of it. I say, do you agree that Socrates had a moral obligation to stay and allow his death sentence to be carried out even if he is unjustly convicted? Most of us would say he has no obligation to do that. But Socrates has this view about our relationship with the state that may not be in line with what we in a democracy would hold. And so I ask you to weigh in the last 2 parts of the question. What do you think of Socrates' argument that a child has no right to strike back at the state even if the state is punishing him unjustly? Okay, so that's question 2. For folks who walked in, I have already gone over, or you already have a recorded lecture of me going over this review sheet. So I'm starting with the current question pool because it's a little different. Even if I went over one in that recorded review, it won't be exactly this one. Okay, so number 3 obviously centers around Dr. King's views in the letter from a Birmingham jail. And again, let me remind you that, that letter is in Blackboard and has been there. Why is it important to Dr. Martin Luther King that we be able to make a clear distinction between a just and an unjust law? Right? Well, consider who he's writing to his fellow clergy. And as I said, there are passages in the New Testament that seem to indicate that basically if somebody is going to be a Christian believer, they should see themselves as basically obligated to obey the laws of the state they're in because God has allowed that state to exist. So these clergy are wondering about the consistency of Dr. King's Christianity if he holds that we can instead disobey the laws of the state. And remember, the clergy wrote to him and said, well, wait a second. How is it that you can advocate as your Christian duty obeying some laws, but then what you're doing now, obeying some laws and disobeying others? Because what you're doing now in going down to Birmingham, Alabama and challenging the segregation laws there is basically disobeying the law. And what was the importance of this for what he was doing in Birmingham, Alabama? Well, the importance is that, as I said, he is now disobeying the laws. So this is why he goes in to this distinction between a just and an unjust law, and he calls historical sources both from theology and from philosophy, to back up his views. So what Dr. King says is, look, I can advocate obeying some laws and disobeying others because we have a duty to obey just laws as Christians, but if the law is unjust, then he thinks it's his duty to not just hunker down under an unjust law, but to actually try to resist it. And here's where he seems to differ from Socrates. If a law is unjust, he quotes Augustine, Dr. King does, that an unjust law is really no law at all and can be disobeyed and should not be obeyed. And so what I ask you to do is to go into these distinctions, and again, if you're going to write on this, you want to look at that part of the essay where we went over the distinctions he gives between just and unjust laws, what characterizes each, and bring that in. As best he can, make his case that segregationist laws are morally unjust, as Dr. King makes that case in his letter from a Birmingham jail. Okay, so again, the pages are the pages in the 11th edition. I don't think many of my students have the 10th anymore. I guess there are a lot of 10th editions floating around. We've been using the 11th for about 2 years now. When we first changed, there were more of them that students would walk in with. But again, the letter I've got online. Okay, number 4, to get through, compare and contrast the views of Martin Luther King and Socrates on the issue of civil disobedience to law. How are they alike? How do they differ? So, and like Socrates, I think Dr. King, again, and I just said this, emphasized that he thought a Christian's duty is to obey just laws. So he would be on board with Socrates when it comes to how we should conduct ourselves versus, in obeying just laws of the state. But here, I think Dr. King differs from Socrates in feeling like it's our duty to disobey unjust laws. I don't think he thinks that we're undermining the state every time we, disobey or react against an unjust law. So would King go farther than Socrates in condoning civil disobedience? Well, I think that's obviously the case. And there again, you can bring in some detail here. If so, why would he do this? Support your view. And again, I have pages from the letter. So, now 5, here, remember I mentioned that in your book, and I do not have a selection from Aristotle there in supplementary readings, but you can get the basics of his view from the PowerPoint that's there. But your text lists about 8 or 10 examples. It summarizes. They're there in the text also, but your textbook authors summarized things like temperance, liberality or generosity, courage, and so even if you don't read the whole Aristotle selection, and I told you that's very challenging. If you're going to write on this, you would do well to at least review the summaries that are presented there, and review my discussion of some of these virtues in the PowerPoint. So here again, something you might write this down if you're thinking of writing on Aristotle. A lot of people like to do this. I say discuss 2 of the following virtues, but if you read over that list and you want to choose a different one to discuss, by all means do. It's just that these are some of the easier, more straightforward ones, right? Can the virtues that you've chosen be portrayed as the mean between 2 extremes? And pretty much all of these, he thinks, can. And we went over a number of times what that is. Aristotle we went over more recently. And so how? So remember, for Aristotle, the virtue is the midpoint, and on each side of it, you have an extreme of excess and an extreme of deprivation. And so what is at the extremes is not a virtue but a vice for Aristotle. So it's only the mean that's the virtue. And, so I would refer you to, the text and the discussion of the PowerPoint on these. What do you think of Aristotle's claim that virtues can be portrayed this way? In other words, does it seem to make sense to portray them mostly as a midpoint, or do you have a different view on this? Did he get it right that this is how we ought to think of virtues? Think about it. If generosity is always the mean, then for someone to give sacrificially, for Aristotle, is not a virtue like it is in, say, the Judeo-Christian view, but it's actually a vice of deprivation. A vice of excess in your giving to excess, where you put yourself in trouble. Likewise, if we're talking about sexuality and the virtue of temperance. And remember, temperance has to do with those needs of our physical bodies for food, for drink, but also Aristotle thought for, our sexual fulfillment. For Aristotle, complete abstinence is a vice. It's not a virtue like it is in some religious traditions, including Christianity. And so, there are things that, Aristotle holds that not everybody agrees with as far as what he would take to be a virtue. So, now here's one. Why should we be moral? Why should we be virtuous? Plato discusses this too. Aristotle's answer, remember, Plato and Socrates, one of the reasons why Socrates wanted to get it right as far as whether he should accept his friend's offer of escape is because Socrates and Plato after him thought that how things go for us in the afterlife, how we're going to be reincarnated, depends on what kind of a moral life we live now, or whether we live a moral life. So Socrates wants to get it right in the Crito as to whether or not he's going to be morally right in accepting his friend's offer of escape, because he thinks if he does it and in fact it's wrong, morally wrong to do that, then that may harm him in the afterlife. Aristotle does not seem to have believed in an afterlife. He believed in a God, not the traditional personal God of monotheism, but a God that was kind of off in the distance, but who created the world. But at any rate, for Aristotle then, the payoff of ethics, the answer to the question why be moral, is not because you're going to have a better time of it in the afterlife if you lead a moral life here, like it is for Socrates and Plato. For Aristotle, the payoff for ethics better be here and now, because we don't think he thinks there is an afterlife. So, in saying virtue is its own reward, guys, I don't want to be competing. I gotta do 2 more classes and talk for 45 minutes. And each one of them, you know.
There's no date on these papers.
Yeah, but I've already told people.
Or when it's due.
Most of the time I do that, or when I post it, where it's posted on Blackboard, I told people the essay is due the day of the test, which is Monday. I'm going to call the roll in just a minute. So at any rate, for Aristotle, the payoff is in eudaimonia. It is in happiness or well-being, living a balanced life. So, okay. And basically 6 has to do with this claim that we can actually develop virtuous character traits by practice, much in the same way that somebody develops skill at playing a musical instrument. Okay, let me go.